You're listening to episode 100 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we speak with Stephen Batchelor about his book, The Awakening of the West, The Encounter of Buddhism and Western Culture. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this milestone in the Secular Buddhist podcast, as we expand into our third digit of episode 100. We would not have reached this point without you, our growing listener community. And it is growing. As of this recording, each episode is getting over 1,200 downloads, with over 142,000 total. The Secular Buddhist is usually, if not always, listed in the top 36 on iTunes for Buddhist podcasts. The Facebook page has over 2,000 likes, and even our Twitter feed is seeing a constant stream of new followers. We have a new website for the Secular Buddhist Association, designed for the development of community, with new sites springing up in other countries. More on that next week. And our sincerest thanks to the many wonderful guests it has been a great joy to speak with. If not for you, this podcast would not have gained the attention it has. Part of the reason for this steady increase in the interest of a secular way of engaging with a traditional practice is our culture, both in terms of our becoming a more secular society and the technological tools I mentioned that foster this growth. Far from being a watering down of the teaching and practice of Buddhism, this is a watering of those seeds planted in new and rich soil, that of our contemporary culture. Conveniently, tracing the evolution of Buddhism in the West is the subject of the book we're discussing today. Stephen Batchelor is a contemporary Buddhist teacher and writer, best known for his secular or agnostic approach to Buddhism. Stephen considers Buddhism to be a constantly evolving culture of awakening, rather than a religious system based on immutable dogmas and beliefs. In particular, he regards the doctrines of karma and rebirth to be features of ancient Indian civilization and not intrinsic to what the Buddha taught. Buddhism has survived for the past 2,500 years because of its capacity to reinvent itself in accord with the needs of the different Asian societies with which it has creatively interacted throughout history. As Buddhism encounters modernity, it enters a vital new phase of its development. Through his writings, translations, and teachings, Stephen engages in critical exploration of Buddhism's role in the modern world, which has earned him both condemnation as a heretic and praise as a reformer. So sit back, relax, and have a nice French lemon ginger tea. Well, our guest today for this episode 100 is Stephen Batchelor. Stephen, thank you for being here again.
It's a pleasure, Ted. Nice to speak with you about the ongoing topicality of this subject.
Yeah, great fun. And we were just talking a little bit before the podcast about the new site. And I also wanted to mention to the listeners that something we're working on is thanks to your kindness and generosity. We expect soon, if not already, to be directing the site for the Secular Buddhist Association from the address that you have had and generously provided to us of secularbuddhism.org. So we're looking forward to that change coming up soon. So thank you very much for that. I do appreciate it.
Well, I'm very happy to have been able to give it to someone who's going to use it instead of just paying every year. So it's worked out very well.
So the thing we'd like to talk about today is two main subjects. First is we'll chat about your book, The Awakening of the West, The Encounter of Buddhism and Western Culture. And after we've talked about that for a bit, we'll have a discussion based on questions that listeners to the podcast have submitted on the website for the Secular Buddhist Association. So let's start with The Awakening of the West. As I understand it, this is a reprint that has just come out this past September in 2011. Tell us about the book, and in particular, why did you want to do a reprint at this time?
Well, The Awakening of the West is a book that I was commissioned to do, must have been towards the end of the 1980s, by someone in Europe who felt that we needed a rather more detailed history of how Buddhism has been perceived, how it's been understood, how it's been transmitted in the West. And there was at that time already a book called How the Swans Came to the Lake, a narrative history of Buddhism in America, published by Rick Fields. The problem with Fields' book, which is a very, very good book, by the way, is that it only focuses on the United States, or primarily so. So we wanted to balance that with a treatment of Buddhism and Europe. So that was my primary focus. And one of the things that I found problematic about Rick's book was that you have half the book is history, and then part two is just a kind of a long, point by point description of all the different Buddhist centers in America. And frankly, in my sense, the book goes rather dead at that point because it just becomes a great inventory. So the biggest challenge of writing the book was to try to find a way around that problem. And the solution I came up with was to actually interweave the story of European contacts with Buddhists going back to the ancient Greeks, coming through the Middle Ages, then into the 19th century, and then into the 20th century, with present-day descriptions of Buddhist events going on in Europe. So I highlight a few little centers and events and describe them, and then flash back to look at the historical antecedents. So I think it works quite well as a narrative structure. The problem is that it becomes very complicated to update it because it means the whole thing has to be reset. If I'd kept all the contemporary stuff just at the last chapter, then I would have just had to have rewritten the last chapter, but unfortunately that's not the case. So the book, when it was originally conceived, opened up a whole world to me about which I knew very little, often nothing. And it was a wonderful way of learning about the story of how Buddhism comes to now, be present and in some ways quite visible and flourishing in traditionally non-Buddhist cultures, those of the United States and Europe. And it really did help me get a sense of the history of my own involvement with the tradition, because I could see it wasn't just something that come out of Tibet and then landed in England, but actually Buddhism had already come from India to Tibet and so forth and so on. And Tibetans had contacts with Europe, since about the 19th century. And so the whole thing began to become more historically embedded in my consciousness. And subsequently also, as you probably know, I have become very interested in the early history of Buddhism in India, the Buddha's life, the political situation in India. A lot of these interests really stem from my work that I did in The Awakening of the West. Now, I seem to recall that when I published the book, that I would probably want to update it every 10 years or so. It's now nearly 20 years since the book came out. The book was originally published, I think, in 1994. but the actual, no, well, the foreword's in 93. The book was probably published in 94. I actually finished it in the end of 92. So we're nearly on the 20th anniversary. It wasn't my idea to reissue it at all, but I was approached by Marshall Glickman, who is the director of Echo Point Press, which is an online publishing house. And he tried to, encourage me to do this. I told him that I didn't have the time really to redraft the whole thing, which would be ideal. So the compromise we came up with was to reprint the text as it was. Remember, the book has been out of print for probably 10 years now, quite difficult to get hold of. And I just wrote a very brief foreword or preface to the 2011 edition, just to sort of put the thing into context. But the interesting point in doing the preface for this new edition 20 years later is that there was virtually nothing that had occurred in the last 20 years that would have merited an additional chapter. In other words, most of the main figures who were the main figures back in the early 90s, most of the main centers, communities, monasteries that were the biggest community centers, monasteries in the early 90s, continue to be so today. And both figures like Dalai Lama, figures like Thich Nhat Hanh are both alive. They're both active 20 years later. Even Sangharakshita, who I also dedicated a chat after to, is still going strong. So in some weird ways, the last 20 years have not seen a great deal of actual development in terms of innovation. I think what has been clearly the case is that Buddhism has become more widely known, that probably there are more people practicing it now in the West than there were in 1990. There's probably more centers, more magazines, more books, etc. But the actual the same traditions, the same key teachers are still active now as they were then. I think the only thing that has really marked a difference that I don't mention in the book is the adoption of mindfulness meditation within non-Buddhist settings, which of course is a key element in the whole secularization process of which we're interested. But nonetheless, I was rather reassured in a way that I did, in the very last section of the book, have a whole chapter on Satipatthana mindful awareness, chapter 20, which was actually the penultimate chapter. The last chapter was on engaged Buddhism. So even at that point, it seemed that there was some awareness of how Satipatthana or mindfulness was going to develop in terms of influencing and affecting people's lives who do not consider themselves as Buddhists. But apart from that, there really is nothing that I would have needed to add. A certain number of the people mentioned in the book have since died, and I've acknowledged that in the new foreword. But in some ways, of course, all the historical material remains the same. Probably if I'd had the time now, I would build in more material on the possible connections between certain forms of ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Epicureanism, Pyrrhonism, Stoicism, and early Buddhism, which I don't really mention at all in this book. But apart from that, I think it's pretty much everything I say stands. There's a few mistakes that I've noted in the preface that I've corrected, but very few. And otherwise, I'm very happy to see it out again.
Yeah, it has some very good reviews on the Amazon site. And for folks who are listening to the podcast, a few of the things that Stephen had mentioned, not only this book, The Awakening of the West, but also How the Swans Came to the Lake, and another book just off the top of my head on Pyrrhonism that you had mentioned, and its connection with Buddhism. I'll be linking those on the episode page for this episode. What were some of the most interesting things you had mentioned that you learned a great deal as you were doing the research for this book? What were some of the moments that stood out to you as, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that when you ran across it in your studies?
Well, one of the most interesting things was how long it took for the West to actually even have a concept of Buddhism. There had been a lot of forays in the Middle Ages. There was a wave of, at the time of the Mongol Empire, the West became, for the first time, rather acutely aware of a threat, not coming just from the Middle East or anywhere, but actually from the Mongolian steppes. And so the popes of that time sent out usually friars on mules to go and check out what was going on. And there is, in fact, the first Buddhist-Christian debate occurs at the court of, I think, Mungka Khan, who was one of the successors of Genghis Khan, out in Karakoram, which is out in the middle of nowhere in Mongolia, where the king, the Khan, had a Buddhist and a Christian and a Taoist, I think, basically have a debate, which is probably one of the first instances of interreligious dialogue, although I don't think the aim was to somehow agree on everything, but for the Khan to decide which one to support. And then you have another wave in the 17th century when the Jesuits, in the wake of the colonialization of Asia that was occurring from mainly Portugal at that period, likewise, began to sort of become aware of something with the local religions, which we now know as Buddhism. But the interesting thing is that the term Buddhism, or a single concept that somehow links Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, etc., together, was lacking until about the end of the 18th century. In other words, although the first Europeans to have contact with Buddhism were actually not aware that this was a single tradition. They just thought these were local cults, practices, philosophies that were peculiar to different Asian societies. It took several hundred years before it clicked that actually all of these traditions had a common source. But it wasn't really until about the beginning of the 19th century that really began to sort of become conscious in the European mind, until we get, say, like mid to late 19th century, the sudden awareness that, without any warning, on the horizon out there in Asia, you have a figure pretty much comparable to Jesus, someone who had taught a very specific doctrine. It had spread throughout most of Asia. It had millions of adherents, all kinds of schools and offshoots and so on. And in other words, the Christian world became aware that it had a competitor that was actually more ancient than its own tradition, was in many respects comparable in terms of its philosophy, its ethical system, its morality, its meditations, and so forth and so on, that they'd previously been completely unaware of. And I think this showed a number of things to me. It certainly pointed out the fact that Buddhism, in a sense, is difficult to pin down to a single identity, that part of its strength lies in the fact that it has diversified and flourished in extremely different forms according to the needs of the specific Asian cultures of the day. And to me, this is one of the great strengths of Buddhism, is that it doesn't need to be tied to some sort of central authority like the Vatican. It's not tied to allegiance to a particular set of core texts like the Gospels. It's able to define itself according to regional cultures, economic systems, but basically the needs of people at those times and places, and it generates, through its own internal flexibility, new forms and styles and iconographies and art and everything. And to me, that's a very inspiring history, because it's a history that somehow empowers us. In other words, as we look back on history, the history of Buddhism and the West, we become aware that Buddhism itself is highly contingent, highly conditional upon all of these various factors to create what we call Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, and so on. And this, I think, allows for our own imagination to begin to think, well, how would an appropriate form of the Dharma be able to sort of take form in our culture? And this, I think, is obviously, a key element in the process of what we call secularization, is that we're able to think, with the lessons of history at hand, of ways of doing the Dharma that are not copying a traditional form at all, but are tapping into certain key elements and, those key elements then become our own resource for finding a practice, a way of life, an ethic that seems to address not just traditional texts or teachers, but the needs and the concerns of our modern world. So that was certainly one thing that really was very important for me to learn.
Yeah, we tend to think of ourselves as rather unique in Buddhism is changing and it's adapting to our culture. How, this is such a rare thing. And I think what I'm hearing from what you're saying, and we can see this by looking back in history, is that no, this has occurred many times. This is just the current adaptation into this cultural context, but it has occurred before and will occur again.
Well, no, that's absolutely right. And but the curious thing, of course, is that although that may seem self-evident to you and I, or anybody who looks over the historical record with a relatively impartial point of view, but of course, it's a perception that runs up against a certain amount of resistance, because part of the polemic, part of the rhetoric of any religious tradition is one that somehow declares its own superiority, one that declares that what it presents is actually the true Dharma, the Buddha, and it has different rationales for that. It's the oldest, it's the purest, comes to the secret transmission of the mind or whatever. But it's all a rhetoric of authenticity. And people who are committed to some particular orthodox version of events do not actually appreciate being told that what they are presenting is just some contingent phenomenon that occurred out of conditions in 14th century Tibet, for example. They like to think and believe, and with good faith and sincerity, that what they're teaching actually somehow goes back in a kind of uncorrupted way back to the mouth of the Buddha himself. Now, a lot rests on that, on those sort of beliefs. And consequently, to suggest that actually, traditional Buddhism is just as impermanent and as contingent and as imperfect as everything else, it is not going to sit very happily with beliefs that are held regarding the truth of our particular doctrines, the authority of our lineage. All of these things are very much threatened by historical awareness of the actual state of affairs. But frankly, I find that historical awareness of Buddhism is a wonderful way of illustrating the core teachings of Buddhism itself, namely that Buddhism is not somehow excluded from being contingently arisen, nor is it excluded from being impermanent, nor is it excluded from being dukkha, from basically being unsatisfactory and imperfect. And that means that it gives us a very good foundation for recognizing and experiencing our Buddhist practice and our Buddhist identity as something that is fluid, that is processual, that is ongoing, that is open-ended, rather than something that is somehow fixed at some temporal point with some claim to a sort of non-temporal authority, and is something that implicitly needs to be preserved as such. So I think it's really very much on the, on the interface between Buddhism and secularity. And I think what's happening in the sort of work that we're doing, that I'm doing, is we're actually experimenting by putting Buddhist ideas in connection with modern secular ideas and basically seeing what happens, seeing what comes forth. And it's no longer something that we have to defer to the greater wisdom or skills of some professional Buddhist elite, but it's something that all of us are engaged with in our practice, if we take it at all seriously, is that we're driven by certain questions that we seek to resolve, not by appealing to somebody's authority, but by working things out reasonably on the basis of experience, on the basis of empirical evidence, and seeing where that leads.
Yeah, to me, that's one of the most exciting things about this historical perspective, and that shift in our approach to looking at the growth of Buddhism is that instead of having to adhere to a particular set of traditions that may not resonate with your particular inclinations, by shifting our perspective into seeing how Buddhism itself grows out of our culture rather than the other way around, that's much more exciting. We get to watch evolution in process. And to me, that's fascinating.
Well, and it is to me as well, obviously. But I can assure you it's not so fascinating for people who do not necessarily embrace that kind of perspective. But I think that's a healthy thing too. I'm glad that we have these tensions within the Buddhist community. And I do think we also have to be aware of the potential downside or dangers even of, maybe rather prematurely offering interpretations and so forth without really perhaps going into sufficient detail into the textual materials. And of course, also perhaps not really going deeply enough into our own experience in our meditation practice. There is certainly a lot, I think we need to always be on our guard against being somehow carried away by a kind of enthusiasm for modernity and for the possibilities of secularizing the Dhamma, and not to lose sight of the fact that this is a tradition that embodies a great deal of wisdom, a great deal of thought and reflection has gone into it, and we need to sort of, regard and to, honor that. Without somehow dismissing it as just a feature of Tibet or something like that. It's far more complicated than a simplistic glance might tell us.
Well, in the formation of the guiding principles that you were a key contributor to that appear on the website, one of the things that we maintained and made a point of maintaining was that perspective that we do engage with scientists to find out about what's going on in the brain during meditation, and we engage with people who are active in engaged Buddhism or social Buddhism, things like that. But we still maintain that this is the Buddha's Four Noble Truths in this world, and that core and important and key teaching is something that, at least here, that's something that we will continue to espouse so that it is something that we're on guard for. And this is one of the primary challenges that more traditional views have had, is that this is a watering down. And really, quite sincerely, that's not it at all. That's not what we want to do. We simply want to find that same depth of teaching and practice within our cultural context.
No, exactly. Watering down is a very easy accusation to throw at people. But of course, watering down is something that only other people ever do. Nobody would actually say, yes, I'm watering down Buddhism. It's a spurious complaint, and it implies a whole sort of raft of unstated assumptions, i.e. that what we're teaching is not watered down. What does that mean exactly? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very easy accusation to throw at others. It's a very difficult one to actually make much sense of when you actually look at what you're doing. And I agree with you. I think Buddhism has demonstrated the ability to reinvent itself over and over again. And I don't really see what there is to be worried about. But what it points to, I feel, is a certain reluctance, perhaps even a fear, on behalf of people who are invested in certain structures of power and certain beliefs, that something might be undermining of what they quite sincerely hold on to as true. But that surely is what Buddhism is about. It's about undermining consolations. It's about undermining fixed views of self. It's about undermining opinions and views that we just hold on to for the sake of them because they're so ancient or whatever. It's about questioning every aspect of our lives and opening up the possibility for another way of living in this world. And if we take that as the core of the Dhamma, which I do, then it's very difficult to see in what sense we're watering anything down.
It's always very interesting when we have conversations that have gone through a change just in the past year with folks who are very sincere and passionate on a traditional view, that we are questioning, and that's maybe not so good, and that really this is the teaching right here.
Mhm.
And what I am always challenged by that is that take a look at the teaching. The teaching is based on challenging what
Mhm.
our attachments are and what our attitudes of self and concepts are. And that's precisely what we're doing. That is the core of Buddhist teaching. And earlier you were saying that as you're doing your research, that people had not really been aware that these different religious practices they were encountering were really part of an overall fabric of Buddhism, that it had a core to it. I find it very interesting that there wasn't the recognition of Buddhism as one thing, uh, and yet we also today still are challenged by I think I could be wrong, traditionally a narrow Western view that Buddhism, there's just one Buddhism, and no, that is not so. And those of us who are involved in it are well aware that there's no one true Buddhism, no one true way to do the practice. And even people who say that will nonetheless sometimes say, but really, here's the way to do it. And it's invariably their own way.
Yeah, I think that's being. I mean, I think that's human in a way. I mean, the it is a big question because as a religion, and I think Buddhism is a religion, or if you like, prefer the word philosophy. It's a philosophy of asking the ultimate questions of life. It's not just a sort of an academic sideshow. It's concerned with what it means to be born, what it means to get sick, to go old, and to die. The big existential questions. And I think it's very much built into our nature that when we ask a question of that nature with complete sincerity and urgency, then the kind of answers that we will find, either given to us or through our own experience, are likely to be treated with the same degree of centrality and urgency as the questions that prompted them. And it's only a hop, skip, and a jump from I have found a genuine response to how to live this life to this is the genuine response to how to live this life. It's and particularly if that's backed up by an idea of a long lineage of people who've had exactly the same ideas, you somehow feel it's quite easy to make that step into a claim for uniqueness, a claim thereby of superiority, a claim of a greater sort of truth value. That seems to be part and parcel of the territory of which we call religion. And I catch myself sometimes speaking in a rather dogmatic tone. I find that my own enthusiasms likewise lead me to implicitly, at least, give the impression that this is the best way to be doing it. I think it's very difficult to be, you see, if you're an academic Buddhist scholar, you have the protection always of some claim towards a kind of detached objectivity about your subject. If you are an engaged practitioner of Buddhism, then it's not something to which you are subjectively indifferent. In fact, you take these ideas terribly seriously. And I find myself, getting very, very, very wound up about trying to defend a certain point or trying to argue a certain case or whatever it might be. And then I realize, or it's reflected back to me, that I'm exhibiting a similar sort of dogmatism as the people I object to. So it has to be very careful because you're dealing with something, in a sense, very central, very intimate, and very important to how people consider the value of what their lives are about or what life is about. And I think you cannot avoid getting caught up into this danger of slipping into a new kind of dogmatism, let's say a secular Buddhist dogmatism, is certainly a possibility.
I think it's very important for people to really have a broad perspective and a little bit of experience in a variety of different practices, particularly if they're not feeling the most positive inclinations towards what they first encounter, to say that this is the one true practice when you've only had one is like flipping a coin once and concluding that it's always going to come up heads. It just doesn't make sense. It's too narrow a data set. And to have a little bit of experience with perhaps a few different traditions. There's no harm in visiting a different center than the one you normally go to and see how things go. You may find something in their particular way of practice that, yes, now that works for me. And it is challenging for us just as human beings to be mindful of our own conclusions and our own attitudes and views, and really be open to those other possibilities, that it's perfectly fine for someone else to chant and have that be a very valid practice in support of what they're doing. It's not for me. It's not for some others, but it is for them. I light incense when I sit. Others do not. There are lots of different forms that this can take, but our practice and our intent of those main existential questions remains the same.
Yeah, I agree. The key really to me, and it always has been throughout my involvement in the Dharma, is to be led by the urgency of my primary questions, not to be led by the rhetoric or the polemic of a particular Buddhist institution. And as long as you keep that clear, I don't think you're going to have these problems. As long as your practice is driven by the sort of questions that propelled the Buddha, at least if we follow the legend, then I think you're going to somehow be sort of kept, at least in a state of openness and of inquiry, of a suspicion about any kind of final answer. And that'll keep you going. And it's true, you will probably, as your practice evolves, move from one form of meditation to another. You might be drawn to different kinds of Buddhist philosophy, or you may actually find that you're finding elements outside of Buddhism to be equally rewarding in certain areas of your life. So in other words, to me, the key is the questioning. Keeping the questioning open and alive will probably be the best safeguard you can have against lapsing into fixed opinions and views, and so forth and so on. And I see that around me. I see that. But another thing we tend to overlook, going back to your point about there being one Buddhism, is that may have been the case in most traditional Asian societies. If you grew up in Tibet 100 years ago, the most you would have been aware of were the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism and some vague historical sense of different things going on in China and India. But basically, your family, your community, your village, your town would have raised you with this idea that this is Buddhism, much as a Christian brought up in Italy today will be brought up with the idea that Roman Catholicism is Christianity. We're in such a different situation now because, if we live in a city in the United States or in Europe, we have access probably within a 30-minute drive of where we live to pretty much every form of Buddhism that's ever existed. You've got your little Tibetan temple down the road, you've got the Zendo, you've got your mindfulness people. It's all on offer. It's all in your face. It's all, and we don't have the ancestral attachment to a particular traditional school or view. And yet the people who teach us, if they're traditionalist, will tend to put across the polemic of the ancestral tradition. And I think for many Westerners, that's a very uncomfortable moment to be in, to find there's a sort of an expectation that you submit to the higher authority of this one particular school over others. And I think many Buddhists in the West find themselves caught in that dilemma at some point or another. To what extent do I give myself totally to this particular group? And to what extent do I retain my own, autonomy, the priority of the particular questions that motivate me to practice? This is a struggle, and I think it's a struggle that will continue as long as we're in this transitional phase of Buddhism trying to find a form and find a voice in the contemporary world.
Well, and individual tastes are going to vary, and I don't mean tastes in a very dismissive way. I mean that at our core fundamental way of engaging with moment by moment living, who we are, varies from individual to individual, which is why this is exciting, this is interesting, this is an ongoing evolution of Buddhism, such that when we see things like mindfulness used as a therapy in that particular context, that's not a watering down, as I see it, of Buddhist practice. That's merely a part of the teaching being used in a positive way to a certain level in a certain context. It doesn't take away at all from our own ability and inclination to do a full-on, deep, Four Noble Truths type practice, and perhaps in a very traditional setting. It's going to find, because it is such a wonderful and comprehensive teaching, it's going to find footing in a variety of contexts that didn't exist in the time of the Buddha.
Well, it didn't exist until the modern world, really. I mean, it's you see, going back to this idea of watering down. I mean, I think you can make a stronger case for watering down when you are told by some teacher that all you have to do to gain a better rebirth is to recite a mantra or something like that. This goes on, or you just have to recite the name of Amitabha Buddha and you'll be reborn in the Pure Land, or you just have to recite Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. That, to me, is watering down. You're basically taking a highly complex philosophy and practice and way of life and ethic, and you're watering and you're basically boiling it down to some little slogan or some mantra or some prostrations or whatever. That's that to me is watering down. What I find very impressive and rather moving about, let's say, those who take up mindfulness practice in maybe to work with some health issue, is that they're motivated to do this with a great deal of sincerity, a great deal of inner what's the word a great deal of internal sincerity is involved. And likewise, when let's say you go beyond just wanting to work on your relapses into depression or whatever it might be, and you decide to take up this practice as something that engages your whole life, it's not done in a sense of it being a kind of some sort of simplistic solution to life's problems. You just have to meditate for 30 minutes a day and you'll be fine. But actually, I find that people take this terribly seriously, maybe too seriously sometimes. But that seriousness, I find, is also very much at the core of what Dharma practice has to be about. In some ways, I think anybody who really takes their life seriously, who takes the questions of existence seriously, is, again, I think, fairly immune to what would dismissively be called watering down. In fact, I feel that there's a sort of another safeguard just in the very, the integrity of your own interest that prevents you from slipping into that sort of, reciting mantras or whatever.
Well, let's take that as a segue then into some of the questions that listeners of the podcast have posted on the Secular Buddhist Association website. We'll take a look at a few of those. We'll start with one from our friend Julian Adkins. You and I both know, we've had very good engagements with, and I actually hope to have on the podcast soon because there are developments in secular Buddhism in the UK that I want to chat with him about and make sure the audience is aware of. And Julian asks about how might 21st century communities best be organized to avoid oligarchic power structures which could end up serving the personal interests of those in power more than grassroots. He's asking about democracy in Buddhist communities and how we can perhaps overcome some of the challenges that hierarchical structures have had.
Well, this is an important question. And unfortunately, I don't have a neat, pat answer to it. I think this is something that is going to be worked out in the actual evolution of the communities themselves. But obviously, the very fact that you are able to pose that question suggests that you are aware of the dangers that might confront you. And that in itself is probably the best safeguard against slipping into those pitfalls. But you see, I think pretty much every uh, leader of a new religion or philosophy or political movement has tended to seek some sort of idealistic community or society that is devoid of all of the ills that previous societies have suffered from. And yet we have a very poor track record in actually achieving such communities and societies. In fact, often, as we see with the example of communism, for example, very nice idea, but you end up with Stalin or Mao, tyranny, and so forth and so on. And nobody started out, certainly not Karl Marx, in foreseeing that might happen. So the trouble is, you can act with the very best motives, and yet still fall prey to the same problems. I've seen this in Buddhist communities. I've seen in the last 20, 30 years, I've seen groups start with very idealistic aspirations, and yet end up being another power structure, another hierarchical structure. I think a lot of it has to do with the logic of or the economy of scale. Once a group achieves a certain sort of critical mass of number, it start behaving differently. And I think this has been shown by a lot of sociological work, that crowds, for example, behave in predictable ways that are not reducible to the best intentions of the leaders of those crowds. And I think that possibly is more important than trying to somehow figure out in theory what a community is that you want to create, but basically don't put any bounds onto how far that can grow. So I do feel quite strongly that to preserve a kind of non-hierarchic structure, we need to work within fairly limited constraints of number. I remember years ago hearing about how St. Benedict first envisaged his monastic order. I can't remember where I heard this from. But once the community gets to be more than 12, you start another group. You don't let it grow beyond a certain number. And this, I think, is possibly workable today. I would like to envision a secular Buddhist community which is composed of maybe lots of different groups,
Exactly.
none of them very big, but nonetheless interlinked. You see, what we have now that early Buddhist communities didn't have is access to technologies of communication that enable us to, be very, much in touch with each other without having our particular group driven by some, higher authority that comes from some big institution somewhere out in Rome or Minneapolis or wherever. And this, I think, allows a degree of freedom, a possibility of retaining a small-scale community, and yet without depriving us of a very rich interaction that is possible through internet and other cyber forms of communication.
And that's precisely the tack that we're taking, because that discussion of size and hierarchy and those kinds of challenges they face is precisely what our conversations have been about, which is why we've structured things so far as we have and ongoing, that we're sharing resources.
Yeah.
That we want our communities to serve more locally while we're still, as you said, able with our modern technologies to be able to allow our common needs and our memes to go forward and serve the right size that we need for our local community. And some of these local communities are going to be virtual, and those also seem to hit a certain critical mass in size before they need to split off. And I think, and I seem to recall some studies in anthropology about the most effective size for human social groups, that after a certain point it's too much and you need to split off and not hit that max again. But that's what we're trying to do with the Secular Buddhist Association site. It's why it's an association. It's not the one secular Buddhist thing. There are going to be many different representations of this, and part of that's going to be because there will be many different ways of engaging with the practice. And that's a good thing. And I think that's one of the primary unique qualities of what we're doing right now and what your work is and what we're doing with the association is we're not trying to hold on to here is our lineage and here is our teaching and this is what we stand for. We're encouraging that growth and that change and that engagement with the practice in individualistic ways or for smaller communities such that it can grow and benefit people engaging with it.
No, well, I think that's very much along my own lines of thinking. But there is, I think, still definitely room for gatherings of some kind. In other words, lots of warm bodies in the same space.
Mm-hmm.
And the obvious format that suggests itself is some kind of yearly conference, or maybe not yearly, but some gatherings whereby we do get together from different parts of America or Europe or wherever we are and meet up with people in a way that you can never replicate through cyber technologies. I mean, there's no substitute for being face to face with another human being.
Well, and as you and I have discussed in the past, that's something that we envision at some point, having a secular Buddhist conference where that's the core thread. But I would like to mention to people who are listening that Stephen will be a key speaker at the Buddhist Geeks conference that's coming up in 2012, and a number of us from our online community will be there as well. So do consider coming to that because we'd love to see you there. And I know it's a big conference. Vince does a really nice job with that. I'm looking forward to that. So that's one outlet for us to get together and have some time together. As Stephen says, having that personal interaction can't really be replaced.
No, I agree. I think that's important. And again, I think it'd be interesting to see to what extent you can sustain a local community on a purely virtual level. I don't know. I mean, I think in sort of, ongoing sort of, exchange of information and so on, yes. But I do think that the actual getting together and making the effort sometimes, just sacrifice an evening or a weekend to get in a car or get in a bus or a train and go someplace, that I think is important. And we must be careful not to slip into the seduction of technology.
The convenience. Yeah.
Actual person-to-person contact, which I do think is really rather crucial. But again, it doesn't have to be many people. To me, Sangha is really about the cultivation of friendships. It's about the cultivation of connections we have with other specific people. And it's the quality of the communication and the relationship that is central to Sangha, not in any sense the fact that there are X number of people who showed up for the sitting this evening. That doesn't really matter. It's the sustaining and the nurturing and the developing of those connections in an interpersonal way that really is, I think, strengthens the bonds that unite us as a community. And that can be done I think your active Sangha can sometimes be just 2 or 3 people. I don't think it's anything to do with number. And yet I think as human beings, we're always rather bamboozled and rather impressed by large bodies of people together in large surroundings. I think we have to be aware of that, but not to sacrifice the importance of interpersonal friendship.
Maybe that's a good segue to one of the next questions on the page, and this is submitted by Stokey. In every culture, there are different pitfalls when it comes to understanding Buddhism. And of course, that's quotey fingers around Buddhism because there is no one true Buddhism. Mm-hmm. After having heard about the pitfalls of other cultures, what do you think are some of the biggest pitfalls to a secular, skeptic, Western Buddhism?
Well, the trouble is, you see, when you look at other cultures, let's say look at how Buddhism developed in Japan, for example, you can see how they got caught up in all kinds of problems. But the difference is that those were problems that were somehow intrinsic to 15th to 17th century Japan. We don't live in 15th to 17th century Japan. We can learn something from the lessons of history, that's for sure. But we also have to be aware that there's no way that we can somehow figure out in advance what all the pitfalls are going to be and then strenuously avoid them. The real most dangerous pitfalls are the ones we won't be able to foresee, no matter how much historical knowledge we have of Buddhism. And so I think, in a way, avoiding of pitfalls is an ongoing practice, moment to moment almost. And I think probably the greatest advice is to become acutely aware of when our behaviors in our secular Buddhist group, for example, we start to notice how certain attachments are developing, certain aversions are developing, certain confusions are becoming more paramount. In other words, the root of all of Buddhism's pitfall problems in the past are probably all found in greed, hatred, and delusion. So surely that would seem to be the place to begin. In your community, are you conscious on an individual or a collective level of certain attachments, aversions, or confusions beginning to drive the dynamic of your group? That, I think, is where the source of the problem will lie. And the trouble with these things is that they're so built into who we are. It's often very difficult to notice their effect on how we then speak and how we behave until we suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, we didn't plan for this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe then it's already too late. It's a mix, therefore, I think, of being conscious of where Buddhism has gone wrong in the past. And again, I mean, the obvious example for me is in the concentration of authority into a professional elite. That's almost invariably when things start going wrong. If you concentrate too much power into too few hands, and if you raise the authority of those powers to a particular degree, in other words, you think that all of the monks are Buddhas, all the lamas are Buddhas, you really have lost any ability to have any meaningful reciprocity or sharing, because the whole thing is biased towards their having the authoritative say. So certainly that's an important point to remember, to notice and to recall always that the Buddha did not appoint a successor, that it seems quite clear that the Buddha saw the Dhamma as his successor, in other words, an impersonal set of practices, ideas, ethics, and so on, which would help to regulate the life of the community. In other words, to go back to some of the earliest visions of the Buddha that have subsequently been forgotten. But primarily, none of that is going to be much use if you're not really on guard against the uprising within your own mind of attachment and fear and hatred and pride and all of these things. That's where the root of the problem is going to lie.
Yeah, ongoing guarding of our minds, which happily is part of our practice. So we should be doing that on a regular basis.
But again, but not to underestimate the power of the mind to delude oneself.
Yeah, it's a very
very insidious.
That is exactly the word I was looking for. That's one of the quotes I'd put up before. It's like playing a game of Simon Says with the most insidious mind ever devised, your own.
Exactly. Yes.
This is a good segue actually to the next question from Ellen123, and it's a rather long question, so I'll try to summarize it. You talk about in Buddhism without beliefs about an individual core, an identity. And Ellen says that as she explores Buddhism, she's experiencing an entity called collective activity, social change through collective energy. And the question is, how can this collective social vision be fruitful when Buddhism is essentially a practice of the individual, whose very actions can be sticky, self-cherishing in regards to intention? How do we resolve that communal social vision with an individual practice? And I think this ties in a little bit to what we were just saying about individual authority and yet having flat kinds of organizational models, which is what we're more inclined to right now?
Well, I think I always come back. I mean, this is a very good question. And again, one for which I have no pat solution or answer, but something we do need to be constantly alert to. And I think, particularly in our day and age, we must be careful that Buddhism doesn't just feed the rather solipsistic tendencies of individualism. And a secular Buddhism, which is putting a lot of emphasis on the individual and so forth and so on, as I do in my own writings, has to be aware that this is not the whole story. The other extreme, though, which is, I think, one in which many of us are somehow reacting against, is how so many Buddhist communities seem to be rather committed to a sort of party line. There's very little room for individual expression of views. There's even, and people write to me explaining that they say, I can't tell my teacher what I feel. I have to write to you instead because you might understand. I mean, to me, that's a breakdown of communication. And it's also, I think, a very sorry commentary on the nature of a so-called community. Now, one of the things that's always been very helpful for me in guiding this line of thought is an idea I picked up from Martin Buber many years ago in his book, I think it's Between Man and Man. And there he distinguishes between what he calls a collective and a community. He's writing in the 30s, I think, and he has in mind the communist collectives of Stalin, probably. But he does make an important distinction. A collective, for Buber, is one in which the cohesion of the group is achieved by everybody sacrificing their own personal opinions or views or desires and towing a common view, a party line, a fixed set of dogmatic beliefs, and working together, sacrificing their own interests to achieve some communal social goal. That's a collective in which the individual is basically suppressed, denied, rejected. A community, on the other hand, is one in which people live and work together not to impose a common belief or practice, but rather to support each person within that community in realizing the fulfillment of their own possibilities as a person. And this, I think, is the key. That when the Buddha spoke of Sangha, he didn't mean groups of monks and nuns. That's quite clear. He meant people who he meant groups of people who had entered the Eightfold Path in a genuine sense. That's what constitutes the first step of Sangha. Now, paradoxically, perhaps, he also recognizes that someone who has entered the Eightfold Path or entered the stream is also someone who's become aparapachaya, independent of others, in the teaching of the Buddha. Now, there I think you do have a really interesting conjunction of ideas. On the one hand, in becoming independent of others, you have also become part of the community. So there you have, I think, in the very earliest sources, a recognition that there is an unavoidable tension going on here. On the one hand, yes, there is emphasis given to autonomy of the individual person, but it is also understood that autonomy is nurtured within a set of relationships. In other words, individualism, I think, is a philosophy, if it is ever a philosophy, which basically is asserting the utter independence of the individual person. It's a kind of precisely what the Buddhist philosophy would critique, the idea that there is some self-existent, inherently existent me. Now, in the way the Buddha presents it in the Pali Canon, at least as I understand it, part of becoming a stream entrant is actually also involves overcoming this sense of self, this Sakkaya Ditthi, this self-view, this ego view. And yet in becoming free of that ego view, you become independent of others. And you also become part of the Sangha. So I think we have to go back to root, back to source in this regard, and to try to begin again to think through the implications of that vision of community, which is one that acknowledges both the necessity of being involved in relationships with others if we're to achieve any communal or social vision, and at the same time, we have to rely on our own judgment, on our own autonomy of mind, in order to be a fruitful and active participant within that community. So that's my basic reply. I'm sorry if it's a bit technical.
No, that's a very good answer because it comprehensively addresses those needs for individuality, because this is a very personal practice. When you're on the cushion or engaging, it is a what's going on inside your own head, your own body, your own mind. That is very personal, but you still do have a communal interest. You do still have those social interactions. It's one reason we called the site an association rather than the community, because there is not going to be just one secular Buddhist community. There will be many secular Buddhist communities, and that individual growth as people write in and say, I'm looking for, most recently someone asked, I'm looking for a secular Buddhist community in Portland. Well, I don't know of one. Here's some resources for you, perhaps on starting one. And what can other people do to help share and support that growth? I think this is the start of those seeds being planted, and we will see them take root. We will see those practices flourish on their own in the unique circumstances in which they find themselves locally. And that's one reason we have the resources available that we do to help with that individual growth. I also wanted to ask, this is one of the questions from Myron D8, is can you suggest some sutta translations that capture the spirit of the originals, since most of us don't speak or read through languages? This is one of the cultural accretions that is a challenge in modern times.
Well, again, it's a simple sounding question that actually is very complicated. For example, what is the spirit of the original? Mm-hmm. And how do we find that? It sounds straightforward, but it's not. All translations, as the cliche goes, are interpretations. Every translator, I'm sure, in good faith, believes that they are accessing the spirit of the original text. And I think it's very hubristic to suggest for any translator to say that they've nailed down the spirit of the text. The spirit of the text is always going to emerge out of your reading of it and what's actually on the page. It's not something that's sort of waiting there to be discovered by the right translator. Of course, I do believe, and I'm very gratified that so many wonderful scholars are continuing to translate and retranslate these texts. And the more translations we have, the better, frankly. My advice really is I'm not going to sort of flag that you should read this person's or that person's translations. I would suggest that if you're interested in a particular sutta, you get as many translations as you can lay your hands on and compare them. Because what you'll find is that a good translator is not going to make it's unlikely, let's say, to make a serious error in the rendition of a sentence. If their grammar and their knowledge of syntax is good enough, and they've got a Pali dictionary, they can come up with something intelligible. Often what we react to is the style, the terminology that a particular translator might choose. We also become aware as we read a particular translator that very often their reading is reflecting a particular orthodox view. And as long as we're aware of that, I don't think it's too much of a problem. But I would suggest, go to accesstoinsight.org. There's lots of translations freely available up there. Read Bhikkhu Bodhi and Nyanamoli Thera's and others' translations in the Wisdom editions. They're very good. But don't believe everything you read. Look and see how varied a particular sentence can be when rendered into English. Think about that. Reflect on it. Don't read the suttas as though they're sort of magazine articles. They're not. They're not intended to be read like that. They're not intended to be read like your average book. They're intended to be reflected upon. They're intended to be put into practice. Um, they're asking of you a much different kind of engagement than to most of the books we would read. It's a bit like the Bible. I mean, a good Christian or a good Muslim, for example, with the Quran, will read these texts again and again and again and again and again, and will find the passages that speak most directly to their condition. And then they'll go into those passages with particular care and depth. It's not only the getting the right translation, which I think is a wild goose chase. It's about cultivating the right relationship with the text that is going to get you into the spirit of it, which is going to have to come as much from you as it does from what's written there on the paper.
Let's take one more final question from the website that's been submitted by the listeners. This one is from Justin Dalton. I would like to ask Stephen if he sees as one potential feature of a secular Buddhism a kind of recovery of an aesthetic passion. If so, could he maybe say a little bit about this?
Thank you, Justin. Justin is someone I know in England. Well, I do believe that part of any kind of renaissance or reformation of Buddhism, not just now, but in the past, has pretty much always been accompanied by the expression of that understanding in different forms of art. In other words, I think an aesthetic appreciation of the Dhamma goes hand in hand with any kind of serious attempt to articulate these teachings in a new form. Because it's, even in writing, I'm very conscious of wanting to write in a way that's not only correct and accurate, but also carries with it a certain kind of appreciation for form, appreciation for the beauty of the language. I don't think that the teachings can be effectively understood in a kind of plodding, rather dead prose. We need to find a voice that transcends the literal meaning of the text and somehow captures the spirit, that word again, of the teaching. But in a way, you see, I think if we go back to this word spirit, the spirit of the teaching, I think, is what becomes internalized in your own life through putting it into practice. And part of that practice involves the expression of that internalized understanding in words and in deeds and in forms. So the way I understand the Eightfold Path, or the way I understand actually what we mean by practice in itself, is not reducible to proficiency in certain spiritual techniques or meditation practices, but actually has to extend along the whole spectrum of how we see ourselves, how we think about ourselves and the world, how we speak, how we communicate, how we work, how we act, how we cultivate attention and concentration. All of this is part of the practice. And as soon as the practice becomes something more than just what I do on my cushion, and it becomes how do I communicate with my neighbor or how do I work in my office, we're into the realms of both ethics and aesthetics. In fact, I think a very good example, I recently read the biography of Steve Jobs. Now, I was surprised to learn how much he identified with being a Zen Buddhist. And in some ways, I feel that his kind of aesthetic in the design of the products of Apple, I do think is informed by a kind of Japanese Zen aesthetic. And I do think that his work, although he was a very, very, very difficult guy to work with, apparently, I do think it was driven by a certain kind of aesthetic and spiritual vision. And I wonder, in fact, as we look back on this period historically, if some of the things that remain from the Buddhism of the late 20th, early 21st century may not be the great books and teachings and so on, but maybe paintings, maybe iPods, maybe certain kinds of music. I don't know. But I don't think that the Dharma can ever really achieve a presence or, in a sense, a kind of a participation in the world in which we live, unless it is committed to the cultivation of a very definite and a very vivid aesthetic style and form.
Well, I have a question of my own, actually. In reference to the engagement between a more secular approach and a traditional approach, I have noticed a change in the engagements that we've had online in the past year or so that has been very encouraging in a very positive way in which these discussions are occurring that have been less antagonistic, less stressful, and that we've actually had very positive and open dialogue. And I see that happening a bit more and more. And you yourself, I believe, have a scheduled dialogue with Ajahn Sujato that's coming up, and we hope to have that available on the site. What has your experience been over the past a number of years, looking more broadly? Are you seeing any sort of change in a positive engagement between a more secular approach and the traditional approaches?
Not as much as I would have hoped for, would be my first answer. Perhaps naively. I had thought that when I wrote, for example, Buddhism Without Beliefs, that this would somehow trigger some sort of debate, a public debate amongst Buddhists. But it didn't really do that. It certainly encouraged a lot of people talking, but usually not to each other. What it revealed, I think, was a kind of a hidden fault line in the nascent Buddhist community in the West between basically conservatives and liberals, if we put it in political language. Those who feel that their Buddhist practice is solidly based upon a particular lineage and tradition and orthodoxy and so forth and so on that survived the test of time and is upheld by enlightened masters, on the one hand, and a kind of liberal, historically conscious, critical, eclectic, interactive approach that is more characteristic of my own work and that of those who are probably listening to this program. I think that all traditions can be seen in these terms. And the fact is, liberals are terribly keen to talk to anybody because they're liberal. Conservatives see the point because they feel that in so many respects, they're not going to change their minds. Part of being who they are is holding on to certain views. So, the best that can be hoped for is some sort of exchange in which, an argument can be had, but there's very little prospect, I think, of really seriously changing people's minds. So I do think we have to recognize that these different branches of Buddhism in the West are probably going to remain somewhat isolated from each other by their own choice, in a way. But it's true that as secular Buddhism, or whatever other variants of this name are now appearing, become more widely known, then I do find, in my own case, that I get invited to larger public Buddhist events, which hasn't been happening so much. But this coming year, I've got a couple of things coming up. The German Buddhist Union want me to give a keynote address on secular Buddhism in Germany in the fall. I've been invited by the Belgian Buddhist Union to give a series of talks in Belgium in June. And I'm getting invited also to contribute to, anthologies and so on. And all of this has happened in the last year or so, far more than it has in the past. I'm also getting more interest from the scientific community and so on. So I don't know whether my experience is representative of wider secular Buddhist experiences, but I do think that at the very least, I think there is a recognition that you can't just think of Buddhism as what is represented by certain traditions and think of the rest either as marginal or as somehow not to be taken so terribly seriously or as watering down or whatever. There does, I think, seem to be a recognition now that Um, some new Buddhist voice, discourse, perspective is opening up, and it can't just be ignored. One of the things at the conference we had in Garrison earlier this year was the extent to which people acknowledged the effectiveness of mindfulness techniques in other forms of life. We've already mentioned this. But I was very struck at that meeting by how some of the more traditional Buddhists acknowledged that there was little in their own tradition that could have been, in a sense, used in a similar way. They certainly, applaud, as a rule, the use of mindfulness in healthcare. But it also makes them aware that, they perhaps need to look more deeply within their own traditions to find comparable methodologies that can be used in a similar way. And so in some senses, the strength of the secular approach is in some ways validated by its actual effectiveness in addressing some real world issues that much of the rest of the traditional Buddhist community has not been so good at.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation for this 100th episode of the Secular Buddhist Podcast. Our guest today has been our friend Stephen Batchelor. We've been discussing his book, The Awakening of the West, The Encounter of Buddhism and Western Culture. For those who are listening, please do come to the website and look at the calendar, because I will be adding on more, as well as a few of the events that Stephen has already mentioned. So you can take a look there for his schedule and, of course, his own website as well. Stephen, again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.